The idea of the right is something that I think needs to be challenged, as does the idea of liberal, and the idea of superstructure politics in general. Because in terms of primary politics or base politics, blacks are overwhelmingly racial nationalists, mestizos are racial nationalists, and the U.S. Democrat Party is the party of that set of racial interests. The hatred of white farmers getting quote unquote free grazing land, i.e., are using land and paying income taxes on their profits but aren't paying an additional tax for land use, while supporting public housing for predominantly black populations who aren't producing anything. Right? A certain double standard here. Right? Or of really wanting to crack down on any minor perceived illegal act by militia types, and the delegitimization of white racial interests or white community defense, or the delegitimization of organized white people, period, organized whiteness, while turning a blind eye to the approximately 12 million illegals who vote and seize resources in a systematic fashion among various cities in the United States in a way that in previous ages required military conquest to achieve, is another, appears to be a manifestation of primary politics. The idea that one group thinks along racial lines while the other doesn't is, it's almost like a pop-up book. It's almost like something out of a Disney movie of like, here's the good guys and here's the bad guys. The idea that one is quote-unquote against racism and the other is not against racism or is racist is just a little bit ridiculous unless you're, like a young dumbass or you're a certain segment of the population. These old farts, these old shit eaters, right? People who have like old faces but have the views of a 15-year-old. These amazing, they just have these ossified brains of stone kind of people. The idea of race neutrality is one of these conventional, it's nominal, it's a superstructure idea. It's similar to the idea of treating males and females the same. It just I judge males and females identically. I judge each male and each female as an identical person. I evaluate the behavior equally. It just doesn't happen. That's not a real thing. That's one of these, right? It's a philosophical synthetic superstructure thing, fabrication. It's a fabrication. You have two ways to explain the racial double standards that white quote-unquote liberals engage in. One, you engage in some sort of intellectual pretzel, or you assemble some conspicuously convenient historical just-so stories that explain any racial disparity and why, granting racial privileges to groups makes sense. Right, like racial affirmative action, not economic affirmative action. Poor whites need not apply, but explicitly racial. Rich blacks get admission bonuses. Poor whites do not. Right? Explicitly racial double standards, right? Justified by some historical just-so story. Or two, right? That's one way to explain the double standards, right? That it's actually a fair double standard because of my theory of history. Or two, that these double standards are a result of them being engaged in out-group favoritism at a primal level, right? They are engaged in out-group favoritism towards blacks and mestizos. And this out-group favoritism, it's very raw. It is a very primal thing. It is just as real as in-group favoritism. It's not enlightened. It's not, it's not that, you're not above the biology. That's your biology. You have the biology of a traitor. That's what it is, right? You have the biology of that worm tongue guy from Lord of the Rings. That's your biology. You're not above biology. You're not, having your conscious mind overpowering the primal mind. No, Your conscious mind is still a slave to your primal mind, but your primal nature is of a worm, is of a snake, right? Let me talk about something else. East Asian females who refuse to date East Asian males, or a certain subset of white females who only date black males. This is not simple sexual preference. If you believe that, you're a fucking boob. You are a boob. If it were, they wouldn't be so strict about it, first of all, right? And it would be merely a bias in that direction. Like they have a bias, like Asian females, like they have a bias towards white males, or black females having a bias toward, or excuse me, white females having a bias towards black males. It wouldn't be an absolute thing, right? But the thing, it is absolute. You have these Asian females who say, I do not date Asian males, right? And you have a certain subset of white females who say, I will not date white males, I only date black males, right? It is an absolute choice because it is a political choice. There was this person, there was this person on Facebook, and she said, she understands, if that's their sexual preference, that's their right, that's their individual choice and all that. Okay, idiot. That's superstructure politics right there. Okay, that's not real. That's not the base. That's a superstructure. But anyway, she was saying, well, I can understand you having a preference for whatever, and that's fine. I'm an individualist and blah, blah, blah. But they don't have to be so crude about it. Why do they have to be such assholes about it? Like, and that is such a conventional point of view, right? Yeah, of course, she's saying they don't have to be assholes about it. Well, yeah, they do. They do. They fucking do. Because it is a political choice, what they're doing. Okay? At the base, it is a political choice. It is out-group favoritism. They are abandoning their group with the perception that this out-group is stronger and that they're going to go with them. Okay? It is a very real thing. It is a very primal thing, a very biological thing. And if you think it's just a simple, almost like a materialistic sexual preference, kind of like preferring this brand of television to another, like no, you fucking fool. It's not about that at all. Okay? Right? Female abandonment of their race has nothing to do with this is imagined to be, well, it's okay for them to do this because individual freedom or something. But the thing is, individual freedom has nothing to do with the titanic evolutionary forces that are at work here, okay? Female abandonment of their race has nothing to do with individual freedom of choice or whatever's going on in your superstructure dominated cognition. When males breed out, that is racial conquest, okay? And that is not so frowned upon, right? For example, I recall, there was this little civil rights painting. It was part of this dumb civil rights mythology museum. And there was this guy who was a freed slave, right after the Civil War. He was a freed slave. He went up north, and he saw this sex show. He went to a play and went to a sex show, and at the sex show there was a white male fucking a black female. I think it was in Illinois or whatever. And it showed the person who was going to these sex shows was a black woman, and it was kind of like a doll of a black woman, and it would show her expressions on the doll based on different events in her life. It would show a kind of an image of the war, and she had a scared face or whatever, and went up north, had kind of a pensive face, and then she saw this sex show, and she had this horrible frown. She was horrified by the white male fucking the black female, right? And of course, of course she would, because that's her race being dominated, right? When tribe A conquers tribe B, they take the women. See? So, now males are not called sluts or whores for breeding outside of their race, or having sex outside of the race. And they're not called race traders as often, right? And when they are, it's not to the same degree. Okay, if males are called race traders for breeding outside of their race, it's not done so with the same passion. Okay, and if it is even done, it's simply done to kind of keep up appearances, because you have the superstructure, which is, race mixing is bad. It's you need to be loyal to the race. That's kind of the superstructure argument. But really, it's about tribal cohesion and staying with the tribe, and that mainly means the females, right? It's not, and you can say that that's not fair or something, but primary politics is not symmetrical at all. That may be the best way to describe it, right? Primary politics is asymmetrical. These are biological asymmetries, in-group and out-group biases, and the differences in evaluations of behavior based on which sex you are is going to be completely different. Okay? Conventional politics consist of, for the most part, rationalizations for primary politics and attempts at coming up with a logically consistent way to justify what's going on at the base. Right? And at the base has to do with race, subracial group, the traditions of that race or subracial group, and the biologically based gender double standards. Okay? Now, when a hypocrisy becomes too galling, sometimes conventional can override primary politics. For example, being having to say that you're concerned about males race mixing as you are with females race mixing, when quite frankly you're not. Okay, and this is not just like a I'm jealous thing. No, like females are concerned about it too. Like females get more offended when they see another female breeding with another race. Like a white female gets more offended when they see another white female breeding out than they do with seeing a white male breeding out. Okay, this is not a jealousy thing. This is more deep. This is not like because that jealousy thing, that would be like a very materialistic, sensational thing. Like it's based on my sensation, my personal, sex things. Like no, it's more than that. It's deeper than that, or more basic than that, more primitive than that. Okay, or another example would be black liberals. Right, really, who are at the primary level are black nationalists, but they call themselves liberal. I'm a Democrat or whatever. Okay, these black liberals, quote unquote, supporting welfare for poor whites. Okay, they will. Like Al Sharpton will say that he supports welfare and he supports whites getting that welfare too. Okay, but that's a concession that they have to make so that the superstructure remains intact, so that it remains consistent. At the base, they don't want to do that. At the base, Al Sharpton does not want to give poor whites 1 cent of welfare. Okay? In fact, maybe even Al Sharpton on occasion has actually said as much in less guarded moments. But at the superstructure, he kind of has to say, welfare for all, right, in order to remain consistent. Okay? Though you will see from time to time many blacks, they'll glob onto any justification that any academic, any kind of professor makes to justify denying poor whites welfare. They'll glob onto that, as is their primal want, right? And that's part of why Tim Wise, for example, is so popular, because he's providing a lot of pseudo-logical justifications for their primal desire to deny poor whites anything. Okay. Right. And so going back to those double standards, like the double standards regarding, one, the opposition to free grazing on land for a white farmer, but supporting not only land that the projects were on, but the actual public housing itself for poor blacks. Right? So they support it for poor blacks, and when that's taken away, well, that's called racism and hate or whatever. But when the perceived, this is actually probably not the case. It's legally complicated, but the perception that there was this farmer, Bundy, who was having free grazing land, right? Oh, well, he can't have that free stuff. But the black people, if you take their free stuff away from them, that's bigotry and hate and all that, right? So there's that double standard. Okay. And second, the son concerned for law and order. Like, well, he has to pay the fees for the grazing rights and all that stuff. And it's funny. Like, you see these people on the Daily Cost and people in the comment section all of a sudden bringing up like line and verse of like what the federal statutes are. All of a sudden, they really care about what the federal law is. Like, all of a sudden, they're real big sticklers on that. But when you talk about the however many, I don't know how many there are. I don't even if they know how many illegals there are, right? But they don't care about any of that, right? They're not real big sticklers on the legality of that. They're only real sticklers on the legality when the legal system is used to bring the hammer down on a rural white, right? Because this guy, is kind of like a militia guy, and that's what the SPLC went in. The SPLC saying, this guy's kind of into, radical libertarianism and is organized in militia groups or whatever, right? Again, the delegitimization of organized whiteness, right? As you would expect from primally anti-white people. Right. So those two things, like the double standards regarding this Bundy farmer situation. Right? I mean, ultimately, I don't. As it turns out, he was paying land taxes to the county, apparently, just not to the federal government, and the BLM saying that he needed to pay to the federal government. That's not really that important because there was a perception that he was getting free grazing land. But let's just go with that. Like, he was getting free grazing land, right? Them caring about that, but not caring about the projects. Them being stickler on the law for him, but not being stickler on the law for mestizo illegals. Suddenly, right? That is confirmation of what I'm saying about primary politics. And when you see U.S. politics at the primary level, the idea that Republicans are right-wing, right? Or the idea of right-wing and the idea of racism being a meaningful descriptor of anything is very, very silly indeed. Which is to say, like, nobody is anti-racist, right? There's no such thing as anti-racist. That's superstructure games, right? Word games, symbol manipulation, right? That's like a synthetic philosophical fabrication that's put on top of the superstructure to make it, that's not the base. Anti-racism, quote unquote, has nothing to do with what's really going on. You're not actually fired up against racism. Okay? The evolutionary mechanisms that animate you supposedly against racism are the hate against a subset of real people. Proper nouns. Proper nouns. Right? Namely, white people who advocate white interests. Okay? Red state whites. Red state rednecks. Okay? Biologically, you never evolved to hate an idea. Okay? You hate people. Right? You may have convinced yourself that, I hate a concept, but try this thought experiment here. Imagine an idea of killing all infants. Does your blood boil at that idea? Probably not. But if you were to get your blood to boil at that idea, like for example in a movie where you have the evil villain who's doing horrible things to children, okay, there you go. You have the actual evil villain doing that, right? And you are likely imagining a real person doing this. You don't hate the idea in the abstract. You hate the person. You hate people. Okay? And most likely, they're doing whatever horrible X thing it is to the infants or the children of your favored either in-group or out-group, right? If you're one of these, these people who, hates their race. I mean, you won't say it because the superstructure, you got to keep up appearances. That would be too brazen. But if, at a very basic level, you hate your race, then you would get more affected by seeing, for example, black children being attacked, whereas you see white children being treated horribly, probably won't feel so bad. Whereas if you're like a normal white person, the typical white person, feels more sympathy towards child of their own race. And of course, most people among whites are obviously have an in-group bias. Even a sizable chunk of white Democrats still have a white in-group bias. a lot of the white Democrat voters are actually, they have, it's a Democrat tradition, right? They vote Democrat because their family votes Democrat. If I had to guess, I would guess that basically, because whites right today are 60-40 Republican. Just about every single white Republican has the white in-group bias. And among the Democrats, I would say that that's probably split, that about 20% of white Democrats still have a pro-white in-group bias at a primal level. They're just kind of dumb. They're just kind of dull. They're just kind of like, well, I vote Democrat because FDR and the New Deal, and I'm a dumbass farmer from Iowa, and, that shit. So there's going to be people like that. So I'd say whites in general, like 80% in-group bias, only 20% out-group bias. And of course it's all along a continuum. And of course the whites who do have an in-group bias, who are voting Democrat, are still, I would say that on average, probably have less of an in-group bias than the whites who are voting Republican. I mean, this is all along a continuum. These are all generalities and all this stuff. So, the evolutionary context in which these kinds of passions evolved were not worlds of ideas, but they were worlds of real people. Right? If one is filled with some sort of anti-passion, like I'm really passionate against some perceived injustice, right? Like say, I am anti-racism, I'm anti-hate, I'm anti-X. Okay? You may perceive yourself cognitively to be anti an idea, okay? But biologically, that's impossible, okay? Because you didn't evolve in a world of ideas. You evolved in a world of proper nouns. You evolved in a world of real people. In order to be passionate in your anti-hate or anti-bigotry, you have to have some sort of hate against real fucking people. Okay, you have to hate some real people, and your brain is gonna, however much you don't like this idea, your brain is gonna draw patterns, right? And if you hate racism, first off, what's probably going on is you have an out-group bias, okay? You have out-group favoritism, and you have a dislike of your perceived in-group, which you do, if you're white, you perceive whites as your in-group, okay? Implicit association tests have shown this. You're not, the idea that you're racially blind is give me a break. It's complete masturbatory crap. Okay, you're not racially blind. Nobody's colorblind. Okay, everyone sees race, recognizes what is their in-group, what is their out-group, and they can have an out-group favoritism, right? They can favor an out-group over their in-group. Okay, but the idea that they're just unaware of race is just, maybe a 3-year-old is unaware of race, but except 3-year-olds are quite aware of race. Anyway. But if you have some sort of anti-passion, it's going to be anti a group of people that you associate with that idea, right? In fact, I would actually say that if you're quote-unquote anti-racist, you're not going to be going against blacks unless you're really pressed hard, unless some people really, push you to be consistent at the level of superstructure. But that's all it is. You'll never have the same kind of passion against, what are called black bigots as you are against what you call white bigots. Never, never. You may, give lip service against black bigotry because you have to, because the superstructure has to remain consistent in order to be able to engage in like the public debate or whatever. But at the basic level, you'll never be, because at the basic level, that's not what it's about. Okay, at the basic level, humans evolved in groups, humans evolved in tribes, humans are tribal. Okay, you can't be consistently against whoever is racist and bigoted in any direction. You can't. Your brain didn't evolve that way. Okay, you're going to have a bias in one direction or another. It's going to be an in-group bias or it's going to be an out-group bias. It's going to be in-group favoritism or out-group favoritism. Okay, it's not going to be neutral. Right? Your brain doesn't do neutral. Nature doesn't do equal.